Black, male, standing still. That was all it took for a badge to tighten, for suspicion to grow, where silence once lived. The morning was soft fog curling around bakery windows, sun barely peeling over the rooftops. But behind the cruiser's windshield they didn't see calm. They saw a threat. No crime, no weapon. Just a man in a navy coat waiting quietly for a ride that never came. In a city where uniforms speak louder than questions, he said nothing. Not when they cuffed him, not when they laughed. Because some men raise their voices, and others raise the stakes. By the time they learned his name, he already knew theirs. You're watching this now, but tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It was just after 7 in the morning when the dispatch crackled through low and scratchy, like a tired voice waking up too soon. The sun was barely pushing through a soft layer of fog that clung to the storefronts like breath on glass, and downtown hadn't quite shaken off the quiet yet. Officer Travis Coyle was behind the wheel, one hand resting on the steering column, the other loosely gripping a cup of black coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Next to him, Deputy Renee Dalton flipped through her phone with the same lazy rhythm that came after too many shifts with too little sleep. The cruiser rolled along Market Street without sirens, just the hum of tires on still damp pavement, everything feeling slow and routine until that voice came over the radio. Suspicious male, black, early 50s navy coat, loitering near Linden and fifth possible match from earlier break-in call. Approach with caution. Neither of them sat up. Neither reached for the light bar. They just exchanged a glance, something unsaid, passing between them, the kind of silent confirmation that comes when two people have done this too many times to be surprised. Coyle tapped the brakes, slowing near the intersection, scanning lazily past a cafe with frost-ringed windows and a pair of parked bikes leaning against a tree. Then he saw him, a tall black man, maybe 50, standing quietly outside a tea house called the Lavender Room, reading something on his phone. A paper bag hung from his wrist like it had just come from the counter inside. Nothing urgent, nothing suspicious. He looked like someone waiting for a ride. Calm, still, unhurried. "There," Coyle muttered, nodding with his chin. "That's our guy." Dalton was out of the vehicle before the wheels had fully stopped. Her boots clipped hard against the sidewalk as she moved, one hand already near her hip. "Sir, let me see your hands," she called, her tone sharp but flat, as if she were reading from a script she'd long since stopped thinking about. The man turned, eyes narrowing in mild confusion rather than alarm. "Excuse me," his voice wasn't defensive, just surprised, like someone who had been pulled from a thought and was still catching up. "You fit the description of a suspect," Coyle added, stepping out slowly, hand brushing over the top of his holster as he moved in closer. "Keep your hands visible." The man blinked, steady but unsettled. "I'm just standing here, waiting for a car." Dalton didn't flinch. "We'll clear it up at the station." It was said like an apology, but not really. And by the time the man could answer if he was going to, Coyle had already gripped his arms, spinning him around with a practiced, unnecessary force. The man stumbled not from resistance but from surprise, his phone slipping from his fingers and landing on the sidewalk with a muted thud. Coyle raised his voice, not yelling but loud enough for the few nearby pedestrians to hear. "Don't resist. We're just trying to do our job here." The man said nothing, didn't pull away, just looked down as the cuffs closed around his wrists with a soft double click that seemed too loud for a street this quiet. Dalton glanced around, noticing a woman across the street pulling out her phone, angling it carefully. She smirked and muttered, "They all get real quiet once the cuffs go on." Coyle laughed. "Probably some fake LinkedIn exec. Bet you $10 he's got a briefcase full of dry cleaning receipts and a speech about civil rights." The man still didn't speak. He stood straight despite the cold bite of the metal on his wrists, his shoulders pulled back, his eyes fixed on nothing, not angry, not pleading, just still. And somehow that made it worse. The silence felt like it had weight, like it had been carried a long way. Inside the cruiser, the air smelled like old leather and burnt coffee. Coyle tossed his half-empty cup onto the floor, started the engine, and glanced at the rear-view mirror. "You got anything to say?" he asked, casual, like small talk. The man looked straight ahead. "I'd like to make a phone call." Coyle chuckled. "You'll get your call after booking. Relax." But something about the way the man had said it, not pleading, not angry, just direct, made Coyle glance at the mirror again. The man's expression hadn't changed. No fear, no panic, just a quiet steadiness that started to itch at something Coyle couldn't quite name. Back on the sidewalk, the camera phone was still recording, catching the taillights as the cruiser pulled away and the sound of muffled radio chatter fading into the fog. And while it would be easy to say this was just another stop, another face, another name, they'd forget by shift's end there was something else in the air that morning, something unspoken that would stick longer than either of them. Expected, because the man in the back seat wasn't just calm, he was waiting. The cruiser rolled through the city like it had a right to be anywhere, tires humming low over the asphalt. The man in the back seat sitting upright, hands cuffed tightly behind him, gaze fixed, not on the officers in front of him, but on some point far beyond the windshield. The interior smelled of worn vinyl and something metallic, maybe the cuffs, maybe the air itself. But either way, the silence inside was thick, disturbed only by the occasional static of the police radio and the low muttering between Coyle and Dalton as they filled the space with empty certainty. They didn't look back often, but when they did, there was something in the man's stillness that didn't quite sit right. Something too composed for someone who'd just been arrested in broad daylight. Coyle leaned slightly to the left and spoke without turning his head. "Most of 'em start yelling by now. This one's playing the long game." Dalton replied with a quiet scoff. "Yeah, probably rehearsing his lawsuit speech in his head." Their voices carried a casual cruelty, not because they were angry, but because they believed they didn't have to care, because this was just another day, another incident, another man they'd process, forget, and leave behind in the system like dust on a badge. The station loomed into view, an old municipal building wrapped in faded brick, the kind of place where every fluorescent bulb buzzed and every door hinge creaked. The cruiser turned into the side lot tires, crunching gravel, the engine settling into a slow idle before the ignition cut off with a soft click. Coyle stepped out first, stretching his back like this was a chore, not a moment of consequence, while Dalton circled around to the rear door, opening it with a tug that felt more mechanical than necessary. The man stepped out without resistance, his balance steady despite his wrists locked behind him, his eyes sweeping the station, exterior like he was taking mental notes, not of weakness but of structure, order, timing. Inside, the air changed. The lobby was colder than outside, lined with institutional gray, a bulletin board littered with outdated flyers, and clipped-off notices of community meetings that never seemed to lead anywhere. The man's boots clicked lightly on the tile floor, and for a moment no one spoke, not the officers, not the booking sergeant, not the two patrolmen finishing paperwork at the counter. Then finally the sergeant behind the desk, Rob Tesh, a man with tired eyes and too many years tucked beneath his duty belt, looked up and blinked twice when he saw who they were walking in. You sure about this one?" he asked, voice low and uncertain, glancing first at the man and then back at Coyle. Coyle waved him off with a half-laugh. "Fits the call. Navy coat loitering. You know the drill," Dalton added. He didn't comply right away. "Figured we'd sort it here." The man said nothing. He didn't nod, didn't roll his eyes. He just waited quiet as breath until the room remembered he was still there. Then in a voice that carried more weight than volume, he said, "I'd like to make my phone call now." Rob hesitated, staring at the screen in front of him as if something there didn't make sense, then looked back up slowly, his voice just above a whisper. "Name." The man answered plainly. "Malcolm Reeve," Rob typed. Something flashed. His eyes paused, then narrowed just slightly, a muscle twitching near his jaw as he cleared his throat and nodded. "One moment." Coyle chuckled under his breath. "Who you calling your lawyer?" "Buddy." Malcolm's eyes didn't flinch. "No," he said calmly, "the Office of Civil Oversight." The room dipped a degree colder, as if the words had drawn the warmth out of the air. Coyle laughed louder this time, trying to shake off the feeling. "Sure, tell him Travis says hi." But Rob Tesh wasn't laughing. He was already stepping away from his desk, quietly moving toward a side office, with a phone in his hand, his posture stiffer than before. They led Malcolm down the hallway to the holding room, his footsteps, even his expression unchanged, the cuffs still biting slightly into his wrists, but not enough to mark him as beaten. He didn't sit right away. He stood at the edge of the bench, scanning the room like someone seeing how long the foundation might hold before it cracked. Then slowly he sat, not hunched, not stiff, but settled like a man who understood this moment wasn't the end of something, but the start. Coyle leaned against the vending machine in the hall, cracking open a soda, sipping it like this was all routine, like nothing had shifted. "You see the look on his face," he said, glancing toward Dalton. She took another sip of her coffee, half smiling. "They always act calm. Doesn't mean they're not guilty." But down the hall in that cold holding cell, Malcolm didn't act. He simply waited, not with vengeance, not with fear, just with time on his side and knowledge that none of them yet understood. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. The holding cell was colder than it had any right to be. Not the kind of bitter cold that cuts through your jacket, but the slow, creeping kind that settles into your bones like damp regret. The metal bench pressed against Malcolm's back as he leaned just slightly, his hands still cuffed but no longer straining his eyes, scanning the empty corners of the room with a patience that looked out of place for someone in a concrete cage. The walls were scuffed, painted over too many times, each layer trying and failing to cover whatever stories had been etched in by those who sat here before. From down the hall, the faint hum of a vending machine mingled with the echo of boots, and the occasional voice rising and falling through the thin air, none of them directed at him. He could hear the rhythm of the building keys, jangling doors, clicking, the muted clatter of paperwork being filed by hands that had forgotten what most of it meant. Malcolm sat still in the middle of it all, not counting minutes, but marking moments, the way you do when you know something is about to shift. He wasn't watching the clock because he didn't need to. What he needed had already been set in motion. When the call was finally granted, they led him down a narrow corridor with peeling paint and a slight flicker in the fluorescent light, above the kind of flicker you stop noticing after a while. Unless you're seeing everything for the first time or seeing it for the last. The phone sat in a small alcove between two locked doors, bolted to the wall like an afterthought, and the cord hung like a loose thread holding the whole system together. The officer who escorted him stood back, arms crossed, eyes barely interested, as if daring Malcolm to use his one call on something that wouldn't matter. But Malcolm didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a phone book or scroll through contacts. He picked up the receiver, dialed a number from memory, and waited as the line rang only once before a voice answered on the other end. "This is Reeve," he said quietly, the sound of his voice steady and clipped, like the message was already prepared before the call began. "Station holding. Civil integrity violation. I need oversight on site by this afternoon." There was a pause, a brief exchange, then he hung up without another word, replacing the phone with a deliberate calm that said more than any outburst ever could. The officer frowned slightly, watching him as if trying to place where he had seen that kind of composure before. Malcolm simply nodded once and walked back toward the cell without needing to be told. His steps were measured, the kind of steps that echo, not because of the hallway, but because of the silence following them. Elsewhere in the station, Rob Tesh was still at his desk, his monitor now casting a pale glow against his face as he stared at something only he could see. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, then opened a drawer, pulling out a laminated contact sheet, not meant for public eyes. He hesitated just for a second, then picked up the receiver and pressed a number labeled Internal Inquiry Confidential. His voice dropped low as he said, "We've got a situation here. Might want to run this name." Then after a pause, he added, "No, I'm not kidding. I think we just detained someone we shouldn't have." In the hallway, Coyle leaned with one shoulder against the vending machine, his eyes on the news running silently on the wall-mounted television above. Dalton stood a few feet away, scrolling her phone, only half listening to the buzz around her. They hadn't thought much of the man's phone call. Maybe a bluff, maybe an act. But they both noticed, though neither said it out loud, how the atmosphere in the station had shifted ever so slightly. The glances were longer, the conversations quieter, and for the first time in a while someone had walked through that door who didn't act like he'd been caught. Coyle popped the tab on a can of soda, the hiss of carbonation cutting through the stillness, and said mostly to himself, "Guy's not even rattled. You'd think he knew something." Dalton didn't look up. "They all try to look tough," she muttered, though there wasn't much conviction in her voice. Because deep down, something about the man was bothering her. Not what he'd done, because as far as she could tell, he hadn't done anything, but the way he moved, like he wasn't afraid of what they'd find, but quietly aware of what they wouldn't. Back in the cell, Malcolm sat again, this time letting his eyes close just briefly, not from fatigue but from focus. He wasn't waiting for rescue, he was waiting for the system to realize what it had just touched. And all around him, without lights flashing or alarms blaring, gears were starting to turn slow, careful, deliberate. Because sometimes the real power isn't in raising your voice. Sometimes it's knowing exactly who will answer when you speak quietly enough. By the time the sun began to slide toward its afternoon arc, the air in the precinct had grown noticeably heavier, not loud or chaotic, but dense in the way that rooms get when something unspoken is passing from person to person. The hallway chatter slowed, the usual jokes between shifts grew thin, and even the tapping of keys behind the front desk felt more deliberate, like people were suddenly aware that the sound of their own routine might be echoing too far. In the break room, Officer Travis Coyle stirred powdered creamer into his third coffee of the day, standing with his hip against the counter, watching the machine hiss and sputter without really seeing it. His knuckles tapped the paper cup out of habit, his jaw clenched a little tighter than usual, though he hadn't yet named the reason. Across the room, Deputy Renee Dalton scrolled through her phone with a look that could pass for boredom, but her thumb stopped moving. Every time someone entered the room, her eyes flickering up just long enough to catch a glance that ended too quickly. Neither of them mentioned the man in holding, not directly, but both of them felt it the way silence crept into places it usually didn't belong. Something had shifted. And though no one had said it, yet it was the kind of shift that doesn't happen unless someone important walks through the wrong door at the wrong time. Down the hall behind closed office doors, Rob Tesh was speaking low into a secure line, his voice stripped of all casual tone as he read off case numbers, badge IDs, and the time of booking. His screen displayed something it wasn't supposed to, and his notes, normally scrawled in shorthand, were suddenly clean and careful, the kind of handwriting you use when you know it might be read back in a hearing one day. Every few minutes he paused, glanced at the door, and lowered his voice further, his eyes darting to the laminated chain of command list on the wall behind his desk. Meanwhile, Malcolm sat quietly in the cell, his posture unchanged, but his mind working in measured turns, not rushing, not worrying, simply tracking. He had learned long ago that panic doesn't change outcomes, but precision does, and the key to every system, especially the ones built to avoid blame, was knowing where the seams were hidden. He didn't need to pace the room or stare through the bars to feel the current building. He could hear it in the footsteps that passed without stopping. He could sense it in the pause before a guard turned the corner. He could see it in the way no one met his eyes anymore. At 2:47 p.m., he was released without ceremony. No apology, no explanation, just a brief signature, a generic belongings bag, and the words "you're free to go" offered with the same flat inflection as a receipt at the grocery store. The officer who opened the door didn't say much, and Malcolm didn't ask. He stepped into the corridor with calm steps, and the same quiet presence he had walked in with. Only now, there was a subtle shift in posture, slightly taller, slightly heavier, not with burden, but with clarity. Two plainclothes officials waited at the end of the hallway, both holding folders, neither wearing smiles. One gave a polite nod. "Mr. Reeve, your transport is waiting." Coyle looked up from his desk, just in time to catch a glimpse of Malcolm walking past the window, flanked by the two state officers, like an executive, leaving a closed-door briefing. He froze his coffee halfway to his mouth, the heat no longer registering against his fingers. "That's not possible," he muttered, half to himself, half to no one. Dalton turned in her seat, following his gaze. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, her voice flat but tight at the edges. No one in the room answered, but Tesh, still at his computer, typed something into a system they couldn't access, then quietly locked the screen. That evening, Coyle sat at dinner with his brother, picking at his food while replaying the day over cheap beer and quieter than usual conversation. He blamed bureaucracy. Guy must have known someone. "Probably City Hall nonsense," he said, trying to sound dismissive, but his jaw clenched too much between sentences. His brother listened but didn't add much, sensing that the situation wasn't as clean as Coyle made it sound. Dalton sat on her porch that night, a bottle of beer in one hand and a slow-burning cigarette in the other, the smoke curling around her like fog that didn't want to leave. She told her girlfriend it was nothing, that the man had probably been released because of some procedural error. "They'll still flag him later," she said. "Nobody walks away that smooth without hiding something." But even as the words left her mouth, she didn't quite believe them. There was something too precise about the man, too careful, not defensive, just aware. Within 72 hours, the whispers started. A mention of Malcolm's name in the morning briefing led to a sharp glance between two sergeants who didn't usually agree on anything. Someone said he used to work in internal affairs out west, another swore he'd seen his name on an oversight council bulletin last year. Even Captain Tolland was different, shorter in his sentences, more measured in his tone, like someone suddenly aware that every word might be replayed someday. Coyle noticed the shift but said nothing. Dalton brushed it off with a shrug and a muttered, "We followed the call. It's all on the body cam." But Coyle's confidence had a crack in it now, hairline thin but widening slowly. He hadn't liked the way Malcolm looked back, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the quiet calm of a man who already knew how this would unfold. Because some people walk away like they're free, and others walk away like they're coming back. The courthouse stood plain against the gray sky, not imposing or elegant, just a stack of concrete and tinted windows that had seen too many stories pass through without ever truly changing. Officer Travis Coyle and Deputy Renee Dalton approached its wide glass doors side by side, both dressed in crisp blues with polished shoes and tightened belts, their badges catching faint reflections in the morning light. They walked like they had a purpose, shoulders squared and jaws set, but there was no ease in their movement today, just the rigid choreography of people trying to convince themselves that routine still offered control. The inside of the building smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax, the kind of scent that clung to memory like static, while their boots echoed off the polished tile floors with each heavy step. They passed through security without a word, the bailiff barely glancing up as he waved them forward toward courtroom 2C, where they had been told to report for a routine testimony regarding a vehicle theft stop. "Should be quick," Coyle muttered, adjusting his belt as they neared the hallway. "Guy probably won't even show." Dalton nodded, but her fingers tapped lightly against her thigh as they walked, a rhythm just barely out of sync with her steps. Something felt off, and neither of them could quite name it, but the silence around them felt less like calm and more like a held breath. As they turned the corner, a uniformed officer approached with a clipboard and a neutral expression. "You two here for the Marston case?" he asked, eyes glancing down before they could respond. "That's courtroom 2C. "Yeah," Halcroft and Dalton. Coyle confirmed, his voice steady but clipped. "This, the guy who loitered on 5th, the officer paused, then gave a small nod, though his eyes didn't match the gesture. "Just head in. You'll see." When the courtroom doors opened, it was like stepping into a different kind of air, denser, expectant, not loud, but not still either. There were more people than usual, more suits, more notepads, and at least 2 cameras tucked in corners with blinking red lights that suggested someone had decided this hearing was worth remembering. Coyle's eyes moved across the room, quickly scanning for the defendant's table, expecting to see the man they had detained sitting with a court-appointed lawyer, maybe shuffling papers or whispering some flimsy defense. But what he saw instead made his steps falter just enough to notice. At the front of the room, beside the judge's bench, sat Malcolm Reeve, not in cuffs, not in civilian clothes, but in a tailored dark suit with a simple silver pin at his collar, flipping through a thick binder with quiet ease. His posture was unbothered, his attention focused, and the nameplate in front of him read, "Special Counsel for Civil Accountability, State Division." Dalton inhaled sharply, barely audibly, and leaned close to Coyle's shoulder. "What the hell is this?" Coyle didn't answer, because for a moment he didn't have words, just the rising thud of his pulse in his ears, and the unmistakable realization that something had gone very, very wrong. The judge's voice cut through the air like a slow, precise blade. "Today's hearing is a procedural review concerning the conduct of law enforcement during an arrest on 5th Avenue, she said, eyes calm but unreadable. "Mr. Reeve will serve in an advisory capacity representing the state's Office of Civil Accountability." Coyle swallowed hard. Dalton's fingers curled tightly around the folder she carried, though she hadn't opened it once since they entered. They were called forward almost immediately, the clerk's voice cool and practiced as she said, "Officers Halcroft and Dalton, please approach." The room didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a microscope, like every eye was not just watching but recording, comparing, waiting to confirm a suspicion they hadn't even spoken aloud. "Can you walk us through your reasoning behind detaining Mr. Reeve?" On the date in question, the judge asked, her voice, not accusatory but pointed. Coyle cleared his throat. "We received a dispatch about a possible suspect in a car break-in. Description matched black male Navy coat standing near the location of interest." The judge nodded slowly, then glanced at Malcolm. "And was identification checked prior to detainment?" Dalton jumped in quicker than she meant to. "He didn't comply when we asked him to show his hands." "We followed protocol." Malcolm still hadn't looked up. His pen clicked once sharp and slow, then he turned the page in his binder with the same ease one might use at a dinner table. Finally, the judge turned to him. "Mr. Reeve, do you have any clarifying points before we proceed?" He looked up then, meeting both their eyes for the first time, not with malice, not with glee, but with the calm weight of someone who had seen this unfold more times than he could count. "In my line of work," he began, his voice even and deliberate, "I've reviewed hundreds of arrest reports that begin just like this. Vague descriptions, quick assumptions, minimal verification, and the quiet erosion of accountability beneath the weight of routine." Dalton's mouth opened slightly as if to object, but before she could speak, Malcolm raised one hand, not toward her, but toward the judge. "I'd like to file a motion to delay direct testimony. The Internal Review Board has authorized a formal hearing into this incident. 2 weeks from today." The silence that followed didn't feel procedural. It felt like a pause at the edge of something deeper, something irreversible. The judge nodded once. Motion granted. Coyle stepped back slowly, almost without feeling it, his body moving before his mind could catch up. Dalton's shoulders were locked in place, her expression tight with disbelief. Malcolm closed his binder, softly stood without a sound, and turned away not triumphantly, not coldly, but with a gravity that shifted the room in his wake. And as he walked out with the cameras following him and every head in the gallery turning, Coyle realized this wasn't the end of a mistake. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The days that followed were quiet in the way. A pressure cooker is quiet before the whistle. Nothing loud, nothing sudden, just the slow tightening of something invisible, humming beneath the surface of every hallway in that precinct. Officer Coyle began to notice it first, not in the obvious ways, but in the small, unspoken shifts, the way conversations stopped when he walked into a room, or how people lowered their voices when they thought he wasn't listening. The desk sergeant who used to greet him with a half-smirk and a shoulder clap now barely nodded, his eyes flicking toward the monitors as if they had something more important to say. The break room still smelled like burnt coffee and microwaved burritos, but the tone inside had changed, and so had the people. They weren't avoiding him, they were watching him. Or worse, waiting. Dalton brushed it off, at least outwardly. She joked a little louder, stood a little straighter, poured more cream in her coffee than usual, like adding sweetness, would dilute the tension that had begun to crawl up the walls. But even she had noticed the closed-door meetings happening more often, especially the one where the captain's blinds were drawn, and 2 people in dark suits sat across from him with notepads and perfectly still hands. She passed by that door twice in one morning, trying not to look, but the sound of the blinds clicking shut stayed with her longer than it should have. Then one afternoon an email arrived in both their inboxes, subject line, plain as stone, preliminary case review materials, Reeve M. There was no message, no signature, just attachments. Many attachments. Coyle opened the first one with a tight jaw, and slow fingers, each click of the mouse landing like a drumbeat in a silent room. Inside the folder was a report from 3 years ago, one he barely remembered, involving a man named Julian York who had been stopped for a broken taillight. The report claimed non-compliance, delayed ID, suspicious behavior, but attached to the report was a statement from York dated weeks later alleging he was slammed against the hood of his car after asking for a supervisor. He'd filed a complaint, but the final notation simply read, "Resolved insufficient evidence." Coyle closed the file, slowly breathing through his nose, the corners of his eyes twitching with something that wasn't quite surprise, but wasn't comfort either. Dalton texted him from across the building. "They're going to make this look like a pattern," he replied without hesitation. "It is a pattern." There was no answer after that, just 3 dots that never turned into words. The next day brought another file, and then another, each one detailing a stop, a name, a moment that had been routine at the time, but now felt magnified, like someone had turned the lens all the way in. There were charts, redacted memos, and timestamps from body cam footage that had either gone missing or was labeled corrupted in the system. The files didn't accuse. They didn't scream. They just revealed. Over and over, quietly, precisely. Coyle started sleeping less. Not from guilt, he didn't know what to call it yet, but from a discomfort that grew in the quiet moments before dawn, when the badge on his nightstand looked less like honor and more like something cold and unblinking. Dalton became sharper in her movements, quicker to correct junior officers, less forgiving of sloppy paperwork. She told herself it was just protocol, but something about the way her name appeared in the footer of those reports made her pulse tighten against the collar of her uniform. At the precinct, more changes crept in. A poster was tacked up near the squad room's civil oversight hotline, confidential. Protected. The rookies lingered near it longer than they should have, reading it twice, sometimes 3 times, before walking away with faces that didn't match their years of training. One even asked Dalton offhand and quiet, "Is this about that bakery thing?" She didn't answer, just stared for a second too long before muttering, "Finish your report." What neither she nor Coyle knew yet, what they were only beginning to feel in the weight of the air around them, was that this wasn't a case review. It was an audit. And not just of one stop or one mistake, but of a culture, a system, a pattern that had gone unchecked because no one had ever looked at all of it at once. At the end of that week, another meeting was called. Formal this time. Uniforms required. Nameplates ready. Inside the captain's office sat the same 2 officials from the courtroom, Granger and Osai from the Office of Civil Accountability. They didn't smile. They didn't ask for coffee. Granger spoke first, voice clipped and low. "We're initiating a formal review into all procedural stops involving Officers Halcroft and Dalton over the past 5 years. Osai added without blinking. "You'll be asked to testify under oath. Cases previously closed may be reopened. Materials have already been collected." Coyle didn't respond right away. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Dalton sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded tighter than she realized. "Are we being accused of something?" she asked. "Not yet," Granger replied. "That's what the hearing is for." Later that night, Coyle sat alone in his kitchen, the lights dim, a manila envelope on the table with his name written in perfect printed letters. He didn't open it, not yet. He just stared at it, knowing that inside were documents he'd signed, reports he'd filed, moments he thought had passed like any other day. But now those moments were coming back one by one, and this time someone was keeping count. And not just someone watching. Someone with the authority to make it stick. The room where the review took place was nothing like a courtroom. No wooden benches, no elevated platforms, no flags on the wall, just a plain rectangular space in a municipal building off a service road with gray acoustic tiles above and an industrial hum that never quite went away. The walls were painted a neutral beige, the kind that promised nothing and remembered even less, but on that day the air inside felt heavier than concrete. Around the long table sat city officials, ethics board members, 2 representatives from the state attorney's office, and a few quiet observers who didn't introduce themselves. There were no uniforms, no badges in sight, just folders, laptops, and the kind of silence that stretches like wire between people who know they're about to witness something that matters. At the head of the table sat Malcolm Reeve, not posturing, not grandstanding, just composed in a way that suggested readiness without aggression. He wore the same suit he had worn in court, though today he hadn't brought a binder, just a slim folder in front of him and a pen that clicked once softly before the proceedings began. On his right sat Miss Osai from the Office of Civil Accountability, her expression unreadable, her hands folded tightly, not out of anxiety but control. Across from them, Coyle and Dalton sat side by side, their backs straight, but their eyes tired, both in full uniform, though neither looked like they wore it the same way they used to. The meeting began without preamble. Osai read the charge parameters, in a voice that didn't rise or dip a formal review. Under Article 14, focused on allegations of abuse of discretionary authority and misuse of procedural stops. Then she turned to Malcolm and said quietly, "Special Counsel Reeve, the floor is yours." He didn't clear his throat. He didn't raise his voice. He just began. "This won't be about accusations," he said calmly. "This will be about patterns." He placed a document on the table and slid it forward. Case 1, Julian York, pulled over for a broken taillight, detained for 47 minutes, no charges filed. Complaint submitted. Body cam listed as unavailable. Dalton shifted in her chair. "That was 3 years ago," she said, more to the table than to anyone else. Malcolm didn't look up. Case 2, Alan Rivers stopped on foot near Maple, and Jackson matched description of robbery suspect. Report phrasing identical to Case 1. No verification of identity. Detained for 50 minutes. Released without charges. He slid the second document beside the first. Case 3, Malcolm Reeve loitering near a bakery, matched a vague description. No ID requested. Cuffed on site. No rights read. Same 2 officers. Same sequence. Same language. The room didn't move. It didn't need to. The weight wasn't in the volume of what was said, it was in the repetition, in the familiarity. In the quiet unfolding of the truth no one had tried to see all at once. Coyle leaned forward, his voice low, almost defensive, but not confrontational. "We respond to calls as they come in. We don't write the descriptions," Malcolm nodded. "But you choose how to act on them. You choose whether to verify before detaining. You choose whether to check ID or assume intent. And those choices form patterns, and patterns unchecked become practices." There was a pause. Then he reached into his folder and unfolded a map marked with small red pins. "These are all stops conducted by officers Halcroft and Dalton over the past 5 years." He let it sit there a moment before continuing. "The pins aren't scattered. They're clustered. Specific blocks, specific neighborhoods. 80% of individuals stopped were Black or Latino. 90% were released without citation or charge." Miss Osai added, "That's not enforcement, that's profiling." Dalton exhaled slowly, her eyes flickering to the corner of the room where one of the legal observers was typing quietly, their face expressionless. "So what she said, her voice slightly sharper. We're on trial for doing our jobs, for showing up, for following dispatch." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He studied her like someone studying the shape of erosion, then said, "You're not on trial. This isn't about guilt. This is about recognition, about accountability. Because the day you stopped me, you didn't know who I was. And that's the point." The room held its breath. "You thought I was another man to be handled. Another quiet report, another entry in a logbook. But I wasn't special that day. I was just someone standing outside a bakery." His voice didn't rise, didn't crack. "You didn't have to treat me like a threat. But you did because you've learned to move through this job with assumptions that feel safe to you, and that safety comes at a cost to everyone who looks like me." Coyle's hands were folded tight enough that his knuckles paled, but he said nothing. Dalton, eyes fixed forward, muttered, "We see the worst of people. We don't get the luxury of hesitating." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "Maybe the problem is what you've come to define as a threat." He paused, letting the silence settle. Because when every gesture, every pause, every face starts to look like danger, the issue isn't the people you're stopping, it's the lens you're looking through. He sat back. For a moment there were no questions. Just the sound of a chair, creaking a pen, clicking, and the hum of the building breathing around them. What made the moment unbearable wasn't confrontation, it was clarity. No yelling, no theatrics. Just the slow, irreversible realization that the shield they thought protected them was now the evidence against them. And still, the hearing was only beginning. By the second half of the review hearing, the air inside the municipal room had changed. Not colder, not louder, but tighter, like the space itself had begun to press inward on the people inside it. Officer Coyle sat with his fingers locked in a quiet vice, elbows close to his ribs, posture tighter than usual, like every muscle had decided it couldn't afford to relax anymore. He had always thought of himself as someone who could explain things when necessary, someone who could walk into a room and make his version sound like fact, but this was different. There was no room for tone here, no edge to lean on, just the unblinking presence of documents, timestamps, recorded voices, and the weight of consequences that had begun to crystallize in the corners of every sentence. Across the table, Malcolm Reeve remained as steady as ever, his voice unhurried, his demeanor unshaken, and his gaze exact, without ever being sharp. He wasn't trying to corner anyone, and that somehow made it harder. He wasn't angry, he wasn't triumphant, he wasn't trying to win. He was just making sure the truth stayed in the room long enough that no one could pretend it hadn't sat there in plain sight all along. "We're not here to talk about isolated missteps," he said at one point, his voice filling the silence but never breaking it. "We're here to examine a pattern that, left unchecked, stops being policy and becomes practice. And practice becomes harm." Next to Coyle, Dalton folded her arms, her chin tilted slightly higher than necessary, her eyes scanning the table with the same quickness of someone searching for an opening that no longer existed. "We've seen the worst of people," she said, the words falling from her mouth more like habit than defense. "We don't get the luxury of second-guessing ourselves every time someone matches a description." Her tone wasn't defiant, but it wasn't apologetic either. It hovered in that space where pride and uncertainty collide, but neither gives way. Malcolm turned toward her, not abruptly, but like someone returning to a point on a map he already knew too well. "I don't deny the job is hard," he said, his voice even. "But when the same kind of face keeps paying the price for the same kind of assumption, then it's no longer about danger. It's about comfort." Dalton's brows furrowed, not in confusion but resistance. "Comfort," she repeated, almost under her breath. Malcolm nodded. "The comfort of believing you're always reading people correctly. The comfort of believing your instincts are never biased. The comfort of never being the one cuffed on the ground for fitting someone else's idea of suspicion." A soft murmur moved through the room, chairs shifting, someone clearing their throat, a pencil tapping against a folder, but no one interrupted. For a few seconds, the only thing louder than Malcolm's voice was the silence that followed it. Coyle's jaw twitched slightly, his lips pressing into a flat line, as he stared down at the papers in front of him. The same papers he had once signed, without hesitation, without review, just part of the day's work. Now each page looked heavier than it had before, like the ink itself had thickened under scrutiny. Then Miss Osai opened another folder with calm precision and placed 3 documents on the table. "These reports," she said, not looking up, "show clear evidence of altered body cam footage logs. One video marked as corrupted, another listed as never submitted, a third re-uploaded under a different timestamp." She raised her eyes to meet Coyle's. "All under your account." Coyle shifted in his seat, his voice caught somewhere between explanation and denial. "That's a tech issue," he said, quieter than usual. "We've had uploads go bad before. It happens." Malcolm didn't flinch. "It might happen once," he said. "Even twice. But not 4 times. Not with this level of consistency. Not when the only common factor is the kind of person being stopped." Dalton said nothing, her eyes now fixed on the glass pitcher of water at the center of the table, the way the light refracted through it onto the tabletop, splitting across the wood like a crack. She didn't speak, because for the first time she didn't know what part of the system she was defending herself, her partner, or just the version of the job she thought she understood. The room stayed quiet, not because anyone had been silenced, but because everyone knew the next word spoken would either admit something or deny everything. A legal observer leaned forward gently, her voice soft but unmistakably clear. "Do either of you acknowledge that your conduct, regardless of intent, may have caused harm to the individuals involved?" Coyle didn't answer. He just blinked slowly and looked down again. Dalton glanced at her lap, then at the room, then finally at the observer. "We've always done what we were taught," she said, and the words hung there like a breath that no one knew how to exhale. Malcolm lowered his gaze for a moment, then spoke so quietly it made the room lean in to hear him. "Then maybe it's time we start teaching something else." Because once you admit the cracks, you can't pretend the wall still holds. And in that moment, it was no longer about whether Coyle or Dalton would lose their badges, or whether this review would lead to suspension retraining or quiet reassignment. It was about something deeper, about whether they or anyone else in that room could sit with the knowledge that the system didn't just fail people from the outside, but had taught good people on the inside to look away when it mattered. That the harm didn't come from malice, but from repetition, and that the most dangerous thing in a uniform isn't anger or prejudice, it's the belief that you're always right. By the morning of the second day, the hearing room didn't feel like a neutral space anymore. It felt like a place where something irreversible had already begun, and everyone inside knew they were no longer just observing. They were participating in a moment they couldn't walk backward from. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sterile white over the table, but nothing could sterilize the tension that lived in every breath, every shift of weight in a chair, every glance exchanged across the table. Officer Coyle walked in looking like a different version of himself, still in uniform, still straight-backed, but somehow aged overnight, like whatever insulation had once protected him from consequence had thinned out thread by thread. He didn't speak much that morning. His greetings were short, his eyes fixed on his folder, but he wasn't reading, he was remembering. Remembering the stops, the reports, the faces. Not because he had wanted to reflect, but because now he couldn't stop. Next to him, Dalton was composed, but it was the kind of composure that tightens around the edges, the kind that holds everything in just long enough to avoid spilling. She wore her usual sharpness like a coat, but it hung slightly heavier today, as if even defiance had grown tired. Malcolm entered without fanfare, his steps, even his focus undivided, his presence no less firm for how calm it was. He didn't bring a new stack of papers this time. He didn't need to. What came next wasn't about numbers or evidence. It was about voices, about stories, about the people who had carried the weight of these policies on their skin, their wrists, their silence. The first man called was Julian York, a former mechanic with salt and pepper hair and eyes that didn't blink more than necessary. He took his seat with quiet dignity and began to speak, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the plainness of a man who had replayed his moment over and over and never found a justification. "I asked for a supervisor," he said, his voice steady. "Next thing I knew, I was face down on my own hood." His words weren't embellished, and maybe that was what made them heavier. "I filed a complaint. Never heard back. Still, don't know if anyone read it." Coyle shifted slightly in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him, but his face remained unreadable. Then came Alan Rivers, a school custodian and father of two, who recounted how he'd been mistaken for a robbery suspect while walking home with a bag of groceries. "They didn't ask my name," he said, looking straight ahead. "They didn't ask anything. My daughter was with me. She was 8. She didn't speak for 3 days after." Dalton's jaw tightened, and her eyes flickered toward the far window, though she wasn't looking at anything outside. She was listening, and the stillness in her shoulders told more than any words could. These weren't dramatic speeches. These were moments. And they came one after another, not a flood but a steady rain that wore down everything in its path. Not everyone showed up. Some had declined. Some couldn't face it again. But the ones who did didn't raise their voices. They didn't accuse. They described. And that more than anything made it hard to look away. One man spoke about how he'd been pulled over 3 times in the same month for a broken license plate light that wasn't broken. Another woman, detained on suspicion of trespassing outside her own apartment building, said she was told to prove she lived there while her keys were still in her hand. Malcolm didn't interrupt them. He didn't nod or prompt. He just listened with a focus that gave every word its weight. When they finished, he would thank them not performatively, but with the kind of gravity that says, "I heard you and so did everyone else." After the last testimony, a pause settled over the room, like everyone needed a second to gather their breath, to look at their own hands, and wonder what they'd ever carried that might have gone unnoticed. Dalton finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, less sharp, more uncertain. "We've seen the worst of people," she said again, but this time it didn't land like a defense. It landed like a question. Malcolm looked at her, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet examination, like a builder finding the fault line beneath a wall. "Maybe the problem is what you've learned to see as the worst," he said. His tone was still soft, still calm, but now layered with a kind of sorrow that hadn't shown itself until now. Because when the worst becomes a face, you recognize but don't question. You stop seeing people. You see profiles. You see patterns. You believe in more than facts. Coyle swallowed hard. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "You don't know what it's like. People lie. They run. They come at you. It changes how you move." Malcolm nodded slowly. "I do know," he said. "I've walked the same streets. I've seen the same fears. But the difference is, when it happened to me, no one asked if I was the problem. They assumed I was." The silence returned, not heavy this time, but reflective, like the kind that follows the first honest moment in a long time. Miss Osai opened another file, her expression unchanged, but her voice firm. "We're entering this into record. Statements will be made available to both council and department review teams. These testimonies are not isolated. They align with documented patterns." Her words were procedural, but the pause she left afterward wasn't. It was space for understanding, for discomfort, for truth. The session adjourned for the day shortly after. As people stood, collected their belongings and filed out, no one spoke loudly. Even footsteps seemed measured. Malcolm lingered by the door for a moment, watching Coyle and Dalton as they gathered their folders. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because by then they knew. This wasn't just about their actions. It was about every silence they had let pass, every look they'd ignored, every story they never thought would be told again, but now had been. In their presence. On the record. For good. The final day of the hearing didn't begin with drama. No raised voices, no media swarm, no grand entrances. Just the quiet rustle of folders opening and the slow shuffle of chairs against linoleum as people settled into their seats with the weight of knowing that something definitive was about to be said. The municipal conference room was lit the same way it had been all week, flat and functional, but the atmosphere had changed in a way no fluorescent bulb could capture. There was stillness in the air, not from exhaustion but from anticipation, like the moment before a verdict is read or a door finally opens after years of knocking. Officer Coyle sat in the same chair he had occupied for days, but his posture had changed, less rigid, more internal, like someone holding on not to pride but to a kind of quiet resolve that didn't come easily to men like him. His uniform was pressed, his boots shined, but his hands remained in his lap, fingers loosely threaded as if tightening them might make him look defensive. Next to him, Dalton kept her shoulders high and her jaw set, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fatigue that no badge could hide. They didn't speak to each other that morning, not because there was tension between them, but because there wasn't much left to say. The silence between them was no longer avoidance, it was recognition. Malcolm entered the room last walking with the same unhurried grace he had carried since the beginning, but there was something more grounded in his step. Now something heavier that suggested this wasn't just another stop on a checklist. He held a single folder in his left-hand edges, slightly worn from use, and when he took his seat at the head of the table, he didn't open it right away. He simply looked around, not to assert dominance, but to acknowledge presence, to show that he saw every face in that room, and more importantly, that he expected them to see him too. When he did speak, his voice was low, steady, and softer than anyone expected. "I've said what I needed to say," he began, each word measured like a step taken carefully in the dark. "You've heard the reports, the testimonies, the language, the footage. You've seen how the same phrases repeat, same methods, same gaps in documentation, same faces being stopped and quietly released." He looked toward Coyle then, Dalton, not accusing but steady. "This isn't about one mistake. It's about the repetition of moments that were never supposed to add up, but now do." He opened the folder with quiet fingers and slid a summary report across the table. "I don't believe either of you came into this job with bad intentions," he continued, and for a moment Dalton's expression shifted just slightly, just enough to reveal something underneath the armor. "But somewhere along the way you stopped checking yourselves. You stopped asking why your instincts pointed in the same direction over and over again. You stopped seeing people and started seeing profiles." Coyle blinked once, his lips pressing together, not in protest but in reflection. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look embarrassed. He just looked tired. Tired in the way people do when the world they thought they understood starts to shift under their feet. Dalton leaned forward slightly, like she wanted to interrupt, but didn't. She just held her breath as Malcolm continued. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's life," he said, and it didn't sound like a defense. It sounded like truth. That's not justice. Justice is being seen. It's making sure the system can't hide behind its own paperwork anymore. It's making sure that someone like Julian York doesn't have to explain to his son why he was treated like a suspect for asking a question. He paused, letting the words hang in the room just long enough to make space for what came next. "My recommendation," he said, voice clear now, "is that Officers Halcroft and Dalton be removed from field duty indefinitely, pending full retraining, psychological review, and an internal department audit of all stops conducted within the last 5 years. He looked toward the City Oversight Board. "I also request that the flagged cases uncovered during this review be formally reopened, not to punish, but to correct." Dalton's lips parted, but no sound came. Coyle didn't move. For the first time in the entire hearing, both sat still, not because they were waiting, but because they already knew. This wasn't a surprise. This was the inevitable shape of everything they'd heard. And for the first time, neither of them reached for an excuse. The board went into closed session, a process that took 35 minutes, though. For those waiting, it passed like a slow, unblinking hour. When they returned, their spokesperson read the findings with the steady cadence of a formal decision. "Officer Travis Halcroft," she said, "you are hereby suspended from active duty, your badge revoked pending reassessment with mandatory participation in oversight proceedings. Deputy Renee Dalton, same." The words were clean. The meaning was not. No one protested. No chairs were slammed. No outrage filled the room. Coyle nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Dalton looked forward and kept her eyes locked on a spot on the wall that didn't blink. Malcolm didn't smirk. He didn't smile. He simply closed his folder, gathered his pen, and stood. As he passed the two officers, he paused briefly, not long enough to create a scene, but just enough for one more moment of truth. Coyle looked up at him. His voice, dry and low, barely rose above a whisper. "I didn't think it would end like this." Malcolm met his eyes for just a second, then replied, "It didn't have to. But that was never up to me." Then he turned and walked out of the room, not like someone who had won, but like someone who had delivered something that had waited far too long to be heard. Behind him, the room exhaled. Quietly, slowly, like something had finally been released. The days that followed, the decision passed, without fanfare. No headlines, no press conferences, no protests outside the precinct. Just the quiet, slow unraveling of routines that no longer fit the people who lived them. Officer Coyle packed up his locker alone on a Wednesday afternoon, the hallway outside dim from a burned-out ceiling light. No one had bothered to replace the kind of detail that wouldn't have mattered to him before, but now lingered, longer in his mind than it should have. His hands moved methodically, stacking paperwork into a cardboard box, folding up a spare uniform shirt with creases still ironed in, and setting aside a mug that read, "Protect, serve, repeat," without irony. He didn't speak. No one stopped by. He had always imagined his departure would look different. Handshakes, maybe a few jokes, the sound of old colleagues slapping backs and pretending not to feel the end of something. But instead, it felt like disappearing into a building he no longer recognized. The sergeant who had trained him years ago passed by without a glance. The rookies looked through him not out of malice, but with the discomfort of people who'd heard enough to know silence was safer than history. He paused once before closing his locker for the last time, staring at the inside of the door, where a faded photo of his academy class still hung the corners, curled upward like they were trying to slip free. Dalton didn't return. Not that week, not the one after. Her name came up once in the squad room when someone asked if she'd cleared out her desk, and the answer came in a half shrug and a quiet, "She's back in Wyoming, I think." No one asked why. No one said goodbye. Her social media accounts were gone. Her number no longer in service. She had vanished, not with scandal, but with the soft finality of someone who knew the story was no longer hers to narrate. Inside, the precinct changes began quietly. A new poster was mounted near the water cooler's civil oversight hotline. Anonymous. Protected. At first, it was ignored, then observed and finally acknowledged in glances and low conversations by officers who hadn't yet decided if it was a threat or an invitation. Training schedules were adjusted. Shift briefings included new segments on procedural review. A handful of officers rolled their eyes, a few nodded, and one rookie stayed late to ask if the video examples shown were real. "Yeah," the sergeant replied. "They're real. That's why you're watching them." In a staff meeting 3 weeks later, the captain announced revisions to the department's stop-and-detain procedures. They weren't sweeping, and they didn't come with banners or applause, but they were there in the language, in the expectations, in the quiet acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't an exception, but a lesson, one that had come late, one that had cost trust. In the records room, someone found a complaint filed by Julian York that had never been followed up. A note was left on the captain's desk. The next week, York received a call, not from an officer but from a member of the city attorney's office asking if he would be open to mediation. He said yes. Not because he wanted compensation, but because someone finally asked without assuming. Alan Rivers received a letter handwritten signed by the mayor's office. It didn't offer justice. It didn't pretend to fix what had happened. It simply said, "We believe you, and we're listening now." And in a small windowless room on the second floor, a new training officer added a question to the standard interview for recruits. "Have you ever made a mistake and learned from it?" The answer wasn't scored. It wasn't even required. But those who paused before answering were always noted, not because they were unsure, but because they were honest. Malcolm didn't stay in the city. He was never meant to. His job was motion case to case, city to city, shifting systems one quiet meeting at a time. He flew out the following Monday, his suitcase small, his briefcase worn his presence, barely noted by those he passed. But what he left behind didn't vanish with him. The weight of his presence remained in the policy binders on desks, in the side glances during briefings, in the silence that followed whenever someone mentioned his name. He didn't leave for recognition. He left for repair. And that's the part most people never see, not the confrontation but the correction, not the punishment but the pause, the shift, the space where people finally begin to ask what they had never been forced to see. And that, in the end, is what real accountability looks like. Not loud, but lasting. 2 months later, the city had settled into something quieter, not peace exactly, but a different kind of rhythm, like a neighborhood that still hears echoes but has stopped pretending they were thunder. The media had long since moved on. The cameras packed away the headlines buried beneath newer scandals, and yet for those who had truly watched, truly listened, something in the foundation had shifted, something that couldn't be undone by forgetting. No parades followed. No one threw a celebration. But the absence of noise wasn't the absence of meaning. It was what came after accountability had done its work, not in fire but in friction. In the corner of the squad room, the civil oversight poster still hung straight this time, not curled at the edges, and while most walked past it like wallpaper, a few paused, reading it a little longer as if trying to decide whether silence still bought them safety. The new recruits, wide-eyed and eager, came in asking different kinds of questions, now less about tactics, more about choices. "What do I do if something doesn't feel right?" one had asked during orientation. The trainer, a lieutenant with 15 years in the field, had answered simply, "Then slow down and ask why it feels wrong." That's where it starts. The training videos had changed too. Gone were the dramatized simulations with blurry actors and stage tension. In their place were real body cam clips, some short, some messy, none of them with easy endings. One of those clips was the bakery arrest. They didn't say the man's name out loud, but everyone in the room knew who he was. They watched the footage in silence, the abrupt stop, the cuffs, the calm refusal to resist, and when the lights came back on, no one reached for their phone. They just sat still, absorbing the weight of what they had just seen. Malcolm Reeve had long since left the city. He didn't leave a note, didn't offer interviews, didn't sign his name to any public statements. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to be remembered to have made a mark. His work didn't exist for attention. It existed for correction, for pulling systems just slightly off autopilot, for making someone pause long enough to think twice before reaching for the easy assumption. In his absence, people spoke of him carefully with a tone somewhere between curiosity and reverence. They didn't know where he had gone, only that he had come through, and things were different now. In a precinct across the state, he walked through a similar hallway, different floor tiles, different badge colors, but the same air of careful avoidance where accountability had not yet arrived. He didn't carry a title that most officers recognized, didn't wear a suit that called for deference, but when he stepped into a room, the silence that followed always felt just a little sharper. He met with oversight boards, listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he asked the same questions every time. What are your patterns? Who pays the cost for your comfort? And when something breaks, who answers? Back in the city, he'd left behind Travis Coyle, now worked behind a glass window at the vehicle impound lot, sorting papers, scheduling releases, and avoiding small talk. No one called him officer anymore. He didn't correct them. He didn't complain. Some said he had grown bitter. Others said he had finally started to listen. No one knew for sure, but sometimes he would pause during a slow shift stare at the precinct from across the lot and sit quietly for a long time without moving. Renee Dalton never returned to policing. She stayed away from cameras, declined every request for comment, and rarely spoke of what had happened, not out of shame but out of a silence that suggested she was still reckoning with it all. She lived closer to her sister, now helped take care of her nephew, and when someone asked what she used to do, she would answer softly, "I used to wear the badge, nothing more." Some of the people who had once been stopped without reason received quiet apologies, calls, letters, emails sent without signatures, but with sincerity. Not all accepted. Some didn't respond. But for the first time, the institution had spoken not to defend itself, but to acknowledge that harm had happened. And that mattered, even if it came late, because that's how change happens, not in a single moment, but in what comes after, in policy rewrites, in slowed hands, in the space between impulse and action, and sometimes in the smallest thing of all, someone in uniform asking a question before making a decision. What Malcolm had offered wasn't justice in the cinematic sense. He hadn't come to punish, humiliate, or destroy. What he brought was a mirror. He held it up steady and clear, and for once those in power had no choice but to look. And maybe, just maybe, someone who watched that reflection carried it into the next stop, the next call, the next morning. Because justice isn't loud, it's patient. And when it's real, it doesn't leave with the man who spoke it. It stays in the choices people make when no one else is watching. What this story teaches us goes far beyond one courtroom or one badge. It's about how easily routine can become harm when no one stops to ask why. It reminds us that power, when left unchecked, tends to forget its purpose, and that justice doesn't always arrive with sirens. It arrives quietly through accountability, honesty, and the courage to face the truth even when it's uncomfortable. For older generations who've witnessed history repeat itself, this story may feel all too familiar. But it also offers hope that people can change, that systems can be challenged, and that dignity can be restored when we finally stop looking away. In life, we all have a choice to defend the way things have always been, or to help shape what they should become. You don't need to wear a badge or work in a courtroom to make that choice. Sometimes it's in how we listen. Sometimes it's in how we speak up. And sometimes it's in whether we pass these lessons down to our children, to our neighbors, to anyone willing to pause and reflect. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you've seen, felt, or lived through, then let it live beyond this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you believe stories like this matter, we invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help keep these conversations alive. Because change starts with awareness, and awareness starts with listening.